Part 3, the research of B.F. Skinner. Just as a warning, there's a lot of terminology in this video and this part of Chapter 5. You can expect to get lots of practice with this terminology as we explore Skinner's ideas through the next 4 modules in Chapters 5 through 8. Most of the animal research we've discussed so far has used discrete trial procedures in which the animal can make one and only one response on each trial. For example, in those puzzle box experiments, a new trial began each time the cat or other subject was placed in the puzzle box. The primary dependent variable was response latency, the time it took the cat to escape the box. There was no possibility of multiple responses. Once the cat had left the puzzle box, it couldn't leave it again on the same trial. There are lots of other experimental apparatuses that can only be used for discrete trial procedures. For example, in a T-maze, the subject can turn left or right, or not move at all. The experimenter can record which direction the subject turns, how fast it moves, the latency to reach the end of the maze, but they can only do that once before they need to reset the experiment and start the next trial. One of Skinner's innovations was to make use of an operant response that the animal could perform repeatedly without the intervention of an experimenter. In operant conditioning experiments with rats, that operant response is often lever pressing. In experiments with pigeons, circular plastic discs called response keys are mounted to the wall above the food hopper, and a computer program today, or when Skinner was first developing these procedures, another type of electrical recording device, recorded the key pecks. It's possible for the animal to press a lever or peck a key multiple times with no intervention from an experimenter. This makes procedures that uses them as the response free operant procedures. The distinguishing characteristics of a free operant procedure are, number 1, the operant response can occur at any time, and number 2, the operant response can occur repeatedly for as long as the subject remains in the experimental chamber. They're not restricted to just one response per trial. Free operant procedures can measure all the same things that discrete trial procedures do, which response, what's the latency, but they can also measure many others, notably including response rate or responses per minute. These options expanded the ways behavioral scientists can evaluate behavior and the questions that we're able to ask enormously. The 3-term contingency is another of Skinner's contributions to behavioral science. It's a framework that can be used to describe the conditions that make operant learning possible. The 3 terms in the 3-term contingency are the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence, the ABCs. Let's start at the consequence and work backward. The consequence is what happens after the behavior occurs. For example, if pecking a yellow response key produces food, the food is the consequence. The key peck is the behavior, the operant response. And the response key being lighted yellow is the antecedent, the discriminative stimulus that signals when the behavior will produce the consequence. In the terminology of operant conditioning, the consequence is called a reinforcer if it strengthens the behavior, that is, makes it more likely to happen again the next time the individual is in the same situation or in the presence of the same antecedent. Suppose pecking a yellow key produces food one day, then the next day, the pigeon pecks the same yellow key even more than it did on the first day. We would say that food reinforced key pecking, or that food delivery was a reinforcer for key pecking. There are operant conditioning equivalents to each of the basic conditioning phenomena that we covered in Module 3. The trial and error learning of Thorndike's puzzle box experiments and shaping through successive approximation in the previous videos are examples of acquisition of an operant response. If pecking a yellow key enabled access to food, the pigeon gains experience with the contingency and the rate of key pecking increases. Sooner or later, the pigeon is eating as much food as it cares to, so the rate of key peck stabilizes or levels off. With classical conditioning in Module 3, we called that the asymptote. Sometimes behavioral scientists use the same term, asymptote, to describe stable rates of operant responding, but you'll also hear the term steady state. Once an operant response is established, extinction involves eliminating the consequence. If the experimental chamber runs out of food during a session, pecking the yellow key, the behavior in the presence of the antecedent, will no longer produce the consequence. And the response rate will probably decrease until key pecking stops altogether. This is extinction. So we might call the procedure of presenting the antecedent and maybe getting the subject to omit the behavior but not providing the consequence an extinction procedure. And when key pecking stops altogether, we would say that that particular behavior, that response, has been extinguished. If the experimenter forgets to refill the food hopper in between sessions, the extinction training will continue to the next day. But at the beginning of the next session, the pigeon might peck the yellow key again a few times, which would be spontaneous recovery. And just as conditioned responses can generalize to other conditioned stimuli, in classical conditioning, operant responses can generalize to other contexts in operant conditioning. For example, a pigeon that has been trained to peck a yellow key might be more likely to peck an orange key than a blue one. All of this belongs in the B.F. Skinner video because, along with colleague Charles Furster and others, Skinner published a prolific number of manuscripts, journal articles, and books in which they demonstrated each of these phenomena and many more using key pecking with pigeons. One of the phenomena that Skinner studied using free operant procedures in operant conditioning chambers was conditioned reinforcement. Recall that reinforcers are the consequences in the three-term contingency, but they're also stimuli. Food presentation might be a reinforcer, the consequence in operant conditioning, or it could also be the unconditioned stimulus in classical conditioning. Just like classical conditioning involves unconditioned stimuli and conditioned stimuli, operant conditioning can involve primary reinforcers and conditioned reinforcers. Primary reinforcers, like USs, don't require any training to function as consequences. You don't need to learn to seek out food, warmth, shelter, companionship. Conditioned reinforcers, like CSs, are initially neutral stimuli. For example, the letter A or a 95% or in Blackboard the color green might be conditioned reinforcers for you in academic settings or in the presence of certain academically oriented antecedents. You experience a greater sense of satisfaction, to use Thorndike's word, when you get an A on a test or a paper than when you get a C. Getting that first A might encourage you to work or study harder to get another A on the next test. It's not that the letter A is better than the letter C. As stimuli, they're initially neutral. It's that the A is associated with greater success, and success is a satisfying consequence, so it reinforces whatever you did to obtain it. Now, exactly how conditioned reinforcement works is the subject of long-standing debate in behavior analysis. Money is another conditioned reinforcer. Most of us like money because it enables us to buy other things we want, not because of what we can do with the bills or coins themselves, or because we like the way they look or feel or smell. Note that even if someone does like the look or feel of money now, that doesn't make it a primary reinforcer. Coin collectors might be said to like the look and feel of coins, but it's still connected, however abstractly, to the possibility of obtaining other reinforcers. The evidence for this is that coin collectors generally don't also collect metal discs that don't have any monetary value. Money is a conditioned reinforcer, but it's also a generalized reinforcer because it can be exchanged for many other things that you might want. As satisfying as it might be, you can't take an A on a test to the 7-Eleven and exchange it for a candy bar. The A is a conditioned reinforcer, but not a generalized reinforcer. Can you think of stimuli that function as conditioned reinforcers and generalized reinforcers in your life?